Good evening, welcome. Thanks a lot for coming to the last in this sequence of our innovation and engagement sessions here in C-Plan, the Northern Building. It gives me huge pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, a colleague and I'd like to say friend, Professor Peter Shirlow from Queen's University Belfast. Pete is a professor currently of conflict transformation at Queen's. Originally, his training is actually as a geographer, so happy to have a further geographer in our midst. My students here tonight will be pleased to hear that. However, increasingly his work has moved into the more specialist kind of areas of political violence and conflict transformation. And it's really his work on Northern Ireland in this topical area that he's particularly well known. Very highly regarded thinker and writer on the topics of conflict and post-conflict Northern Ireland, working on a range of topics. For instance, Republican and loyalist transitions from political violence to power sharing. He's done a lot of work in public publishing on that area. Collaborative work on the post-imprisonment adjustment of former political prisoners in Northern Ireland and their transition to living in a post-conflict society and the way in which they adjust to that political change. And a more core geographical topic, work that he's done on ethno-sectarian segregation and the urban politics of fear. Not only working in the academic field, Pete works as an advisor at various levels in various contexts. For example, he's currently working as the chair for the office of the First Minister and Deputy First Minister's panel on conflict-related convictions. Hugely important work then advising the Assembly in Northern Ireland on issues of conflict resolution and transformation. He's also a regular contributor to media outlets commenting on Northern Ireland's situation. He's spoken on various occasions on BBC Radio, Radio 4, and also more recently a piece on the current situation in Belfast, following the issue of the flag over City Hall. He's in The Guardian commenting on that situation and what it seems to be saying about the direction Northern Ireland might be going in. And he's written on all of these topics. He's recently won various prizes, been nominated for further prizes for his publications. And he's also begun to move more broadly into issues of conflict transformation and resolution. So not only working in the Northern Ireland context, but also I think he's been working on the Baathification in the Iraqi context. So a knowledge, therefore, a wealth of knowledge about the broader topic, context of conflict resolution, and applying that expertise elsewhere. So a very distinguished academic, a distinguished researcher, and a distinguished commentator on foreign affairs around the topic of conflict transformation. So it's a really a great privilege to have Peter with us tonight to speak, and to also expand his work on Northern Ireland specifically. So I'd like to put our hands together and Peter will speak for 45 minutes to an hour or so, and then we'll have half an hour for engagement and discussion. And hopefully we'll have lots of things to ask Peter about on his work. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. And of course, thank you, Richard, for inviting me. We're sure all of you appreciate Richard's energy and his drive and enthusiasm. And he's one of the nicest people I know in academia, which is rare because most academics are hard work. So I'm very pleased to be here tonight. It's funny, there's people in here of different generations, quite clearly. And well, when I first came to live in England, there was, which was in the 1980s, mid to late 1980s, and the news came on, the 9 o'clock news, British news, English news, BBC News. And we were sitting watching the news, and the first news item was about the collapse of the economy. Nothing's changed. And then there was something about some war somewhere else in the world. And then this little item came on about somebody being shot dead in Northern Ireland. And the guy sitting beside me picked up the remote control and turned off the TV. And I went, why did you turn the TV off? And he goes, that Northern Irish thing is so boring. And then he realised, and I went, oh, I don't mean that, I don't mean to be offensive, And I said, the reason why I'm sitting in England is because Northern Ireland is so boring. Don't be offended. I would find this a peculiar, complex conflict. If I was sitting in England and looking at this conflict and wondering, why are our soldiers there? Why are people killing each other? Why are people engaging in a process that just doesn't seem to stop? So of course, since then we've moved on very significantly in the Northern Irish context. There is a different feel in many ways to the city. It's even, dare I say, quite sophisticated now. We have our coffee shops and our restaurants. When I was a student in Belfast in the 80s, when the conflict was quite difficult, there were basically 2 restaurants in the city, and the bars closed at 11 o'clock, and there was really nothing to do. And we were living in this conflict zone, and you were living under that constant fear when a car pulled up behind you of, is this it? Is this the moment in which I'm going to join the list of casualties? And there was an anger and there was a frustration there. And one of the things I want to talk about tonight at the very end of my talk is about the younger generation, how they now experience Belfast, and how Belfast then, for some of them, is very, very different. It's a place now of mixing, it's a place now of intermarriage, it's a place now of hope for that generation. But of course we must understand that in terms of social class. As our city has improved, as our political situation has improved, we really have entered a two-speed process of those who are marginalised and left behind, and those who have moved on and are enjoying the benefits of a new city, new lifestyles, new cultures, new types of consumption, etc. So in many ways, our city is like any other city, but we still have a remaining hangover of conflict and victimhood that distorts how we understand Belfast. And Belfast to me is not really a city, it's a group of cities. There's a western part which is Republican and Catholic. There's a northern part which is, still very contentious in terms of boundaries. There's a southern part which is very affluent and doing well. And then there's the east of the city, which is a mix of poverty and affluence. It's very much become a very disconnected city because of the conflict and because of segregation and difference. So for my father, Belfast was a city, it was one city. For me, it was a divided city. And for my children, it's more of a socially divided city, as opposed to where B was a sectarian divided city. So what I want to do is just go through the whole context of what's really happening in Northern Ireland. And one of the things I think is really interesting is, as you enter a post-conflict situation, relationships have to change. You can't build a peace process, you can't develop a peace process unless people talk to each other. You can't develop a peace process unless you understand that at some point you have to share. And what also happens in a peace process is it takes away some of the anger, especially amongst the younger generation who didn't experience death and violence and state repression and anger in the way that my generation did. So one of the things that's happened in the city is what we'll call hot nationalism. Those who are still very much involved in sectarian behaviour and sectarian actions. A cooling nationalism. Some of those people who would have been very belligerent and sectarian and political are trying to form some type of new relationship between segregated places. And then this new generation, some of them are oldies as well, but this new generation who are pretty post-nationalist and don't really get it, and don't really understand why there's hot nationalism or why there's this difference within society. So there's not just a peace process that is taking place in Belfast, there's also new social processes. So when I was a student, most of us were punks. Any of us who didn't subscribe to orange and green went into punk rock because it was a place where you could express anger and express frustration. And it's funny how that, now, whenever I was a student, if we were in a lecture hall when I was a student, the Catholics sat there, the Protestants sat there, and the lefties, and the Smiths fans, and the Clash fans, and the geeks, and geeks are good, you need geeks, because they're important, because they're different. They sat in the middle, okay? And so you walked into a lecture, because one side was GAA tops, Gaelic athletic tops, one side was rugby or Rangers tops, and in the middle you had the difference. So the middle was very small. And now when I go to the lectures now, many years later, many grey hairs later, when I go to the lecture, the Catholics sit over here, but they're about a quarter of what they once were. The Protestants sit over here, they're about a quarter of what they once were. And the bit in the middle is much more mixed. The geeks and the punks and the alternative identities have now taken. There's a different set of relationships compared to what we once had in that environment. Now, one of the things that's important about conflict is how you disguise the realities that essentially we all come from the same cultural background. So in Irish history, quite clearly, there were Protestant Republicans. There were many Irish Catholics who served in the British Army. There were, it's not as simple as just saying Catholic Republican or Protestant Unionist. There were people who moved across those boundaries. And there were also people who had no boundaries at all, that they lived in this other alternative space. So what you do in a conflict is you disguise anything which is about hybridity. You disguise the mixed marriages, you disguise that your great uncle fought at the Battle of the Somme, you disguise that your great uncle was in the IRA and he was a Protestant. You disguise all of that complexity of what a family tree actually is. And what you do when you engage in a conflict is you subvert everything to a hot nationalism. You subvert everything away from the abstract and into something which is pure and uncontaminated and which is imagined. So the whole process of conflict is to get rid of difference. It's to marginalise difference, disguise difference, cover up difference. It's how you tell people, we have always been this way. We've always had this history. We've always had this identity. We've always had this culture, when in fact that is not true. So in Northern Ireland, for example, Northern Ireland had more members of the trade union than any part of the UK. There was a trade union movement which was mixed. There was a Northern Ireland Labour Party which was mixed. All of those things were subverted by the conflict. The Northern Ireland Labour Party, socialism, all of those things were really squeezed at the start of the conflict. So the constitutional question was put in front of difference. Violence was put in front of difference. And what you do is you select histories and you start to take sides. Not everybody took sides, but the whole idea of violence is to assault plurality. It's to create stereotype. It's to create singular narratives. It's to create something which is pure, something that is, as I said before, imagined. Now, this is my great-grandmother's Ulster Unionist Council. So if you were in Belfast now, somebody would say Pete's abroad, right? Because my family are members of the Unionist Party, which ran Northern Ireland up until 1972. Now, what's interesting about my grandmother's badge, which comes from around the time of the First World War, is the cultural mix. This is an Irish symbol. This is cultural Irishness, which is represented by the crowned harp. It is an Irish symbol. It is a symbol that would have been as much used by Republicans as it would have been used by Unionists and Protestants. And you see on the other side the Union flag, which would be a recognition of their Britishness. So for my grandmother, or great-grandmother, she was culturally Irish, but politically British. For my grandparents, when I understood them, and when the trouble started to begin, they were culturally Irish, but they were politically British. So they would have sang Irish songs, they would have celebrated St. Patrick's Day, they would have known some Irish words, they would have had Catholic friends, they would have engaged in a sort of a cultural Irishness. So a bit like the Welsh, everybody enjoyed England losing in the rugby on Saturday. Correct? If you're not English, the Scottish enjoyed it, the Welsh enjoyed it, the Irish enjoyed it, whether they're Protestant or Catholic. If the England football team wins, it unites the rest of the UK. Okay? If you've got your Scottish culturalists, your Welsh culturalists, you've got a reserve still amongst the Protestants. Sort of not an anti-Englishness, but a sense of being different in some way. So what happens, of course, to that is that during conflict, these types of symbols which were part of unionism, disappear. They are simply just removed. So the symbol becomes the Union flag, the symbol becomes the collective memory of Protestantism or Britishness, as opposed to understanding your cultural Irishness. And at the end of the talk, what I'm going to argue is some of that is coming back. Some people are starting to recapture the hybridity, the mix of their cultural identity in more recent times. So if I was to show that, but I showed that first to Republicans, they didn't believe, they thought it was made up. Some of them said, "You made that up, that's not true." And I went, no, this is the actual badge, this is their cultural Irishness displayed in many ways. Now, what we have is the Belfast Agreement, and the idea of the agreement, obviously, the agreement is actually a very interesting piece of lawmaking, and a very interesting way to solve conflict, because it's basically a box of dairy milk. Okay? So some people like caramel, and some people like hazelnut. I don't think anybody likes macaroon, but anyway. There's something in the box you don't like, and there's something in the dairy milk box that you do like. Okay? So basically the Belfast Agreement, think of it as a box of chocolates. The Unionists got what they wanted, and the Republican Nationalists got what they wanted. So everybody had the Northern Ireland's constitution, Northern Ireland's politics was put into a box, and you could choose the confection that you liked. Okay. So it's actually about bringing together cultures and putting them within a frame of mutual respect. Now, technically, of course, not emotionally, but putting them in the same frame. So for unionism, which is defined by pro-Britishness and pro-unification, all of these parties, with the exception of the Democratic Unionist Party, engage in that process of the Belfast Agreement, and Republicans, as the IRA, Sinn Féin, SDLP, engage in the same way. So let's think about the chocolate box and how that operates. So one of the commitments of the agreement was to partnership, equality, and mutual respect. And that Northern Ireland, constitutionally, had to form relationships between itself and the Republic, and also between these islands. So, for Unionists, the constitutional issue was the United Kingdom, including the Isle of Man, Guernsey, that was the East-West relationship. And for Republicans and Nationalists, it was the North-South relationship, so cross-border bodies were created. So that gives you an Irish dimension of the government, and then the constitutional issue is Northern Ireland remains in the United Kingdom. So, for Unionists, North-South relationships are a no, and for Republicans, East-West relationships are a no. But you get both. Both are guaranteed within the new constitution. Obviously, for Unionists, what was important was the total and absolute commitment to exclusively democratic and peaceful means. So basically, the decommissioning of republicanism. Now, forgetting, of course, that there were also loyalists who were armed in many ways, at times encouraged by Unionist leaders. But for Unionists, that's a success. It's the capacity to say the IRA didn't win. The IRA had the weapons, and the IRA lost. Okay. What's also important to Unionists is the principle of consent. That Northern Ireland cannot be changed without the majority of voters choosing for it to change. The Constitution is now enshrined as a principle of consent. So you get rid of the IRA, and you have the IRA, or Sinn Féin, signing up to a recognition that you can only change the Constitution of Northern Ireland through democratic means, i.e. there is no legitimacy to Republican violence. So people usually understand the agreement as Unionists tell you they lost, but actually when you think about it, they actually did get major concessions out of Republicans. So basically the IRA had to sign up to what was one of their core beliefs, which was that violence was legitimate, that creating a united Ireland was legitimate, and they had to sign up to the Belfast Agreement, which says, no, we can only use democratic means to achieve. What's also put into the Belfast Agreement is the recognition of your birthright. So therefore, in legal terms, in access to work terms, in a thing we call Section 75, which is quality proofing of all public services, etc., you cannot be discriminated against because you're either British or Irish. So if you're British or if you're Irish, you have exactly the same rights and entitlements and access to work, public services, etc. So that's crucially important because within the United Kingdom, there's an endorsement of Irishness, which is both quality but also culturally. Up until 1985 in Northern Ireland, the Anglo-Irish Agreement, it was illegal to fly the Republic's flag in Northern Ireland. It was illegal. You couldn't hoist an Irish tricolour in Northern Ireland, which is what the IRA did, is they would put them up poles, attach bombs to them, and then when the police removed them, they would, there was 1 or 2 officers were killed removing the flags. So that's really important to the nationalist Republican community, in that their cultural desire, and their political desire, and their political identity is endorsed as valid. You have a right to wish for United Ireland. So that's an achievement for them in that sense. What's also important was we had a police force which was 90% Protestant. And of course, there was a great deal of hostility to the police force from within the Catholic, nationalist or Republican community. So this is a big emotional issue for Unionists, because the majority of people who were in the RUC were Unionists. And we can't forget that like 350 of these people were killed. So one of the concessions that Sinn Féin get and the SDLP get is that you have to have a new police force, that you have to change its uniform, that you have to create oversight bodies, and that you have to create equal access in terms of 50-50 recruitment. So this emotionally for Unionists was seen as dreadful. It was seen as the abandonment of those who had defended Northern Ireland. So you see how we're building up the box of chocolates? Everybody's getting a bit of what they like and what they don't like. And then what also was very emotional for the Unionist community as well was the release of paramilitary prisoners. And that was a concession in particular to Sinn Féin. Their argument is the conflict's over. If you accept our bona fides and the conflict's over, then you have to release the prisoners. And yet again within the Unionist community, that was seen as very difficult and very emotive to them, because they think of the Union as dead. They think of the contribution, as they would see it, to standing up to political violence, or terrorism as they would call it. So therefore, basically, the whole way in which the agreement was then advanced was through achieving decommissioning of all weaponry. So you're opening up the police, you're bringing in 50% of your recruits are Catholics, even though the majority of people who apply are Protestants. You have a quota system there, and then in parallel to that is the whole issue of the decommissioning of weapons. So that's not a resolution to conflict. The conflict in Northern Ireland wasn't resolved. The conflict in Northern Ireland was transformed. We didn't end up in United Ireland. We ended up in a country that recognises the right to be in the United Ireland. Nobody won. Okay, that's the whole spirit of the Belfast Agreement, is that nobody could win. Nobody would be in charge or would dominate society. So the government had to be power shared, political power was power shared, etc. So you're creating this sort of sense of a binational society. A society of equal influence, equal access, equal citizenship, equal rights. So you're trying to transform a conflict, okay, in many ways. So peace then drops very slowly. We have this big agreement, we have this real enthusiasm for peace, and at the beginning of the peace process, and when we get the Belfast Agreement, a very strong sort of positiveness within society, and then it slowly starts to drift back into the old repetitive cycle of sectarian confrontation, violence, disagreement, argument, etc. So yet again, remember this is a process. We're working through these issues. We didn't expect Northern Ireland to become a new society. We knew there would be problems, but we were trying to work our way through what that is. One of the major problems, of course, is constitutional uncertainty. I don't know how to say this more politely. Catholics have more children. There's a different demography. Flanagan's poem, Sex was invented in Ireland in 1974. Okay. You have different uses of contraception historically. Okay. So basically you have two demographies. You have a Protestant demography, which is basically what used to be called a gentleman's family, in those who were pejorative terms. All Protestants had 2 kids, and Catholic families were much bigger. And that came out of the different faiths and the different issues around contraception, etc. Now the Catholic population is starting to slow down, the demographic growth is starting to slow down. But the two populations are starting to narrow. So at the foundation of the state, it was 65-35, and the most recent census, it's now about, it has been worked out properly, but it's about 42-38. So the Catholic population has become more numerous, and that has an impact upon uncertainty. Because if you have if the future of Northern Ireland is based upon the electorate, there will be a day when the majority of the electorate are Catholic. Now, we'll come back to that in a minute. It doesn't mean they want United Ireland, that's a different issue. But that creates uncertainty within a community, especially the unionist community, which senses that it's lost to the IRA and shit. The manipulation of victimhood, very early in the period of peacemaking, the whole notion of victimhood became very, very politically sensitive. And you'll understand things like Bloody Sunday, and you'll understand that Sinn Féin and the SDLP have run a very strong campaign about state violence. Now, that can be done because the state has laws and rules and regulations. You can put the state in the dock. You can have inquiries into state violence because the state has rights to give. You can take a legal case pointing out that what happened on Bloody Sunday was illegal. You can prove that there was collusion between loyalists and the British state. There's an entity that you can persecute, that you can take to court. The problem for the unionist community is they also talk about victimhood, but you can't put the IRA in front of a human rights tribunal. You can't put the IRA in front of the European Court of Human Rights. It doesn't have rights to give. It's a non-state formation. So one of the things that's happened in our peace process is that Protestants feel that most of the inquiries, most of the legal issues about victimhoods have been one way. That we've had the Bloody Sunday inquiry, we've had other inquiries into collusion, we've had proof that there was collusion, etc. So their simple question is, where are our inquiries? Without actually thinking you can't really have those types of inquiries because it's a different formation. So victimhood has become a major problem for some people. Of course, the same context remains generally about who do you blame. So one of the things you do in conflict is you must present yourself as blameless. To keep people on board and to legitimise your violence, you must take on the air of blamelessness. We did this because we were right. We did this because we were persecuted. We did this because we were defending our rights, we were defending our culture. And that becomes part of a lack of sort of humanism, a lack of understanding all of the victims, who they are, and like everybody cries the same. Everybody's traumatised the same when they lost a loved one. And what we have failed to do is create a sort of humanist understanding of conflict and violence, and we've made it into a political football in many cases. There are like 90 victims groups in Northern Ireland, and only 3 are intercommunity. They're either Republican, Nationalist, Unionist, or Loyalist. There's only 3 that actually work between both communities. Disguising concessions, creating new conflicts, and I'll come back to this in a minute about new types of resource competition, issues over parading. The perpetuation of segregated lives has continued, sectarianism has continued, and it seems that there's no real development of a political middle ground. So you would assume if you stop a conflict and you take the tensions out of society, that you might create a new liberal left type political alliance. It hasn't really happened. And we'll come back to reasons why that maybe hasn't happened in a minute. So we still have problems, and we still have difficulties, and we still have issues. So this is a representation of people who died in our conflict. And I've used different colours here to show some of the ambiguities. So the top row are the security forces. So you can see 3,600 people died in our conflict. Okay. So the second biggest group were members of the security forces, 134. As you can see, 984, 95% were killed by Republicans. So that's why I put that in orange. That's what's important to the unionist community. These people were killed by Republicans. That's important to them. Catholic civilians, were the biggest group of people who died in that conflict. And as you can see there, the majority of them were killed by loyalists. So that is a major issue and concern. The old Scass song, long shot kicked the bucket. So what's interesting, so what's important here about Catholic civilians is for within the Republican nationalist community, these are the people who are responsible for those deaths. Now, actually, a quarter of all Catholics were killed by Republicans. Never mentioned. In the context of blamelessness and monocultural understandings of the past, you never hear about these people. Now, some of them were killed intentionally, some of them were killed accidentally. But a quarter of all Catholics were killed by Republicans. You would never hear that spoken about in Northern Ireland. Because Protestants don't, in general, I'm using these terms very generally, most Unionists don't really care about those people. And most Republicans want to disguise that they brought harm and violence upon their own people. For the Protestant community, of course, what's important here, although there's fewer Protestants who died as civilians, of course, Unionists make no distinction between civilian and security. They see them as the same. If you were to ask a Unionist how many members of your community died in the conflict, they would say 1,600. They wouldn't say 624. They would lump the state security in with Protestant civilians. So here again, this is why it's an orange, because the Republicans were responsible for the majority of those Protestant civilian deaths. Of course, yet again, not mentioned, a quarter of them were killed by loyalists. Another missing part of the jigsaw, because it doesn't fit an narrative. It doesn't fit a political position to recognise these people. When we look at Republicans who died, 372, so Republicans were basically fighting the state. You can see how there's very few conflicts in the world in which the insurgents had fewer victims than the state. Northern Ireland is virtually unique in that the insurgents killed more state forces than in most societies the other way around, that the state kills mostly insurgents. So what's important here, of course, is that of the Republicans, a significant number were killed by the state. That's what's important within the Republican community. Of course, failing to admit that nearly 1 in 5 were killed in feuds. A significant number of Republicans who died in the conflict were killed by their own fellow members. Okay? What's also really important, which is forgotten, a third of them basically died because they were carrying bombs. What went on? 17, 18-year-old men. The average age of a Republican who died when carrying a bomb or making a bomb was 18 and a half. Young men making bombs. Forgotten. Not part of the narrative, because what the narrative has to be constructed around is what the security forces did and what the loyalists did. So forget about this, forget about that. So loyalists, 128 loyalists died. Again, which is very interesting, only a quarter were killed by Republicans. More were killed in feuds than actually were killed by Republicans, and a smaller number, of course, were killed by the state. So when you look at that, if you think of anybody here who's ever listened to the rhetoric in Northern Ireland about conflict and death, you won't have heard the niche. It's not heard. There's a voicelessness to many victims because they don't suit a narrative. They don't fit into the jigsaw puzzle in the way that they do. Something that's very interesting is Republicans were fighting loyalists, which is interesting. Republicans killed more Republicans than were killed by loyalists. And more loyalists were killed by loyalists than were killed by Republicans. You see the point I'm making? If you're in the IRA, you were twice as likely to be killed by a Republican than you were by a loyalist, and vice versa. That too, again, doesn't fit into the narrative of what the structure of conflict is. So that all becomes selective memory and a selective understanding of conflict. That's the hot nationalism. That's the refusal to look at Great Granny's badge, to look at the real complexity of what this actually was and what it actually means. It's making it selective and narrow. Now, one of the problems we have in our society since 1998 is our suicide rate has doubled. Now, in England, Scotland, Wales, and the Republic of Ireland, the suicide rate is actually, until the recession, has gone down. Okay. Whereas in Northern Ireland, our suicide rate is doubled. And what's really interesting about the doubling of the suicide rate is it's mostly people who lived during the conflict. It's the Troubles generation, it's the post-traumatic stress disorder, it's the having seen things in the 70s and 80s. And we know from the work of Habermas and others that during a conflict, people bond together. So I think one of the times when the United Kingdom actually was a United Kingdom was probably the Second World War. It was a bonding of people because there was a common enemy. And one of the things we know from the literature is 10 years, 20 years after a peace process begins is when people start to take their own lives. Because the bonds that are there, the social bonds that are there, start to wither. You don't have a common enemy. If you're upset or traumatized by something you observe, you can displace that into a vocation or a belief or an ideology. When that starts to trickle away and the bonds of comradeship start to disappear, then it's the same process that's been observed in Lebanon, etc. That's when people start to reflect upon the past. And also what is involved in that is an aging process, which is also a process of reflection. So many of these people who've taken their lives are former Republicans and Loyalists, and also police officers, or people who were harmed during the conflict. So it's definitely related to the conflict that this has taken place. And as I said, with comparison to Great Britain and the Republic at the same time, their suicide rates went down. So it's the abnormality of Northern Ireland, which is like that. But we've also done research with former security officers, police officers actually, prison officers, and former Republicans and Loyalists. This is a very important piece of evidence because it points out the futility of violence. If you're a former combatant, you're 4 or 5 times more likely to be alcohol dependent than the standard population. So around 55 to 60% of security force members and former paramilitaries are alcohol dependent. And also engaged in hazardous drinking. You're 5 or 6 times more likely than the standard population of Northern Ireland to be on antidepressants. So there are very, very significant consequences of engaging in conflict. So in some cases it's suicide, in other cases it's self-medicating with alcohol, self-medicating or getting medication from GPs, etc. Now Northern Ireland already has 2.5, 3 times higher use of tranquilizers than the rest of Great Britain, which again, of course, we'd assume is linked to higher levels of poverty, but also linked to the conflict. So basically we have a generation of men, in the main, and mostly men. We reckon probably of the age group 55 to 65, we reckon about 1 in 5 men were involved in the conflict in some sort of combatant role. Whether they were in the police, or the army, or the paramilitaries. We're talking about a very significant section of the population who were involved. So that's intergenerational. That leads to breakups of marriages, leads to problems with children, who have adjustment problems with their parents, who have these emotional problems, psychological problems, etc. It's a really major problem in our society. And we have a major problem of antidepressants. Now this proves the worthlessness of Northern Irish governance. We have no proper health strategy to deal with a post-conflict society. Political energy can be put into flags, political energy can be put into arguments about resources, but there is no identifiable care strategy. So if you spend your time talking about victims and politicising that, if you spend your time politicising flags and culture, if you spend your time watching the other side and what they're doing, you forget about how you construct a society. How do you heal a society? How do you move a society forward? Because part of that is emotional reading. And that shows you the disregard for how you actually engage positively in a shared way, that you could do that within our society. We have very high levels of poverty. Catholics are more likely to live in poverty than Protestants, although the Protestant working class is becoming more impoverished, as are all working classes. One of the pieces of research we've done at Queen's over the last 6 years, we're following 600 families who live in segregated areas, and we're looking at how they understand the post-conflict situation. So Catholics are more likely to be unemployed. Catholics are more likely to have mental health problems. Catholics are more likely to have less disposable income. So Protestants are more likely to be at work. They're more likely to have higher disposable income, and they have better mental health. So within these working class environments, religion still matters. So if you're a Catholic, you're more likely to be unemployed, long-term unemployed, have psychological problems, have adjustment problems, have breakups of families, and have very little disposable income. On the other side of the wall, Protestants are more likely to work, they're more likely to have good mental health, they're more likely to have deal with adjustment issues better. When you ask those people about the conflict, the Catholics say they won, and the Protestants say they lost. I think it's rare in any society, if you have two groups of people, and one is slightly better off than the other, that the one that's slightly better off feels bad about the future. Because they don't understand these, or generally don't understand these as economic processes, they understand them as political, cultural processes. So when we ask the people who say on the Catholic side that they feel positive, we say, why do you feel positive? And they go, well, Sinn Féin are in power. We got rid of the RUC, and we're demographically on the rise. And when you say to the Protestant community, why did you lose? Sinn Féin are in power. They're demographically on the rise, and we have no place in this society anymore. That's where you need a different politics. Maybe recognise that in 1979, if you were an unemployment benefit, you had 33% of the median wage. Today you have 11%. How do you de-sectarianise poverty? Why are these people sitting in a process of cutbacks, withdrawal of social services, increased poverty, greater educational disadvantage, and they understand it through culture, not through class? So the Catholic working class will understand that the Catholic middle class have taken off. The Protestant middle class took off. That there is no such thing as unionism or republicanism in terms of your class position. So this is one of the things that's really problematic, is you don't understand the real source of the politics of poverty. You understand it as resource competition. And that's very damaging within our society, and that's a very strong example of a hot nationalism. You know, the argument you should make is we're both living in poverty, we're both affected by the same welfare costs, we're both affected by the same issues, but no. So we have high levels of worklessness, we have the lowest wages, some of the lowest wages compared to Great Britain. We have very high rates of disability and long-term illness. 80,000 people in Northern Ireland were injured in the conflict. Now, out of a population of 1.7 million, that's quite high, but 9% of those people live in segregated working class areas. John, maybe in some working class communities, 1 in 4, 1 in 5 people who are physically injured in the conflict. Another significant problem that we have. So low wages and poor quality part-time jobs, obstacles to women in gaining the labour market. So that's not creating a different politics within the hot nationalists. It's just repeating the same old, tired, repetitive, sectarian understanding of society. It's not creating, where that should be creating a question of why when Belfast is rebuilt and they have a cathedral quarter and it's snazzy and it's cosmopolitan, why am I living here in a community in which most people can't get work? People in these communities aren't questioning that they're being displaced socially. They're questioning are they being displaced by their religion. And I think that's a very important point. So this is a cartoon from the Irish Times. It's about the whole issue of poverty and unemployment, and it says, with regard to the issue of the Sinn Féin want a border poll, we want to have a test to see if there can be unification. And the cartoon reads, under which constitutional arrangement would you prefer to be unemployed? Because if you live in Cardiff, or Manchester, or Dublin, you're under exactly the same social processes. That's what's happening. So even if you have United Ireland, you're still going to be on the dole, because the economic system of the Republic is exactly the same as the economic system in Northern Ireland. It has the same welfare cutbacks, it has the same issues. Now, so hot nationalism and the whole imagery of hot nationalism was about representing dominance and creating fear. So these are pre-ceasefire wall murals. So clearly this is a threat to any Catholic who enters the community. Hooded gunmen, guns at the ready. The whole celebration of that sort of masculine, violent community, or section of that community. And this sort of legitimisation of that. The UVF reserves the right to strike Republican targets where when the opportunity arises. Interestingly enough, of course, going back to Great Granny, you can see one of the UVF flags has a shamrock. Coming out of a cultural hybridity, which was there at the start of the 20th century. So that's very obvious, it's menacing, it's threatening, it's disturbing. Now, if you're going to engage in a peace process, you need to change the images. You can't have a peace process in which you have those types of images in that way. So this is an example of another loyalist image. Here we have, this plays on Jerry, Tom and Jerry. This is from Tom and Jerry, yeah. Okay. And Jerry as in Jerry Adams. Okay. So we know in Belfast, a kid who's walking around in a Celtic jersey, we're pretty sure he's from the Catholic Nationalist Republican background. Okay. Lots of people in Northern Ireland support Glasgow Celtic or Glasgow Rangers. I always point out that it's in a different country, because they support them because of the sectarian connotation within that. So here you see a very localised image, pre-ceasefire, where the local fruit band is represented as the dog out of Tom and Jerry, and you have all the symbolism of the Britishness and Northern Irishness, and he's assaulting this quite clearly Catholic town. So yet again, it's about violence, about menace, about threat, about how you create this sense of fear within the other community. So also pre-ceasefire, we have the image of the only woman who ever united Protestants and Catholics in Ireland. They both hated her in equal measure. Lady Thatcher, Mrs. Thatcher. I think of many other names, but anyway. So here you have the corollary to that, the opposite side to that, within a Republican community pre-ceasefire. So poor, vulnerable Ireland is being dismembered, chewed up, swallowed up by Thatcher and her British policies. And then you have this legend, get the Brits out. What does that mean? Me? If I saw that 20, 30 years ago, I would go, does that mean me? Because I'm British. I have to go. What does that mean? So it's a threat, it's yet again the implied threat that you have to go, you have to get out of our country. Ireland is one unit. There's no discussion of it ever being anything else. Come to the Belfast Agreement, principle of consent, very different concept. Of course, what's also important is that we have had events more recently which have very much been about some of the violence we've had post-1998. So this represents our Down, and an event. What time is it? 10 minutes. Okay. So this represents the Holy Cross event. What basically what happened at the start of the Troubles, there's an area called Ardoyne. One part was Protestant, one part was Catholic. Whenever the conflict started, the Protestants took one area, so Protestants moved out of the Catholic. One bit was predominantly Protestant, one bit was predominantly Catholic. So basically, through violence, they swapped. So the Protestants who lived in Catholic Ardoyne went to Upper Ardoyne, and the Catholics who lived in Upper Ardoyne went to Catholic Ardoyne. They swapped. Do you know, some of you are probably too young to remember a band called Texas Midnight Runners? Yes? You know the photograph of the kid standing with a suitcase? That's the Protestants moving out of Ardoyne. For those of you who are of the email or the Facebook generation, you can go and look that up later. Dexy's Midnight Runners. You know the song Gino? Yes? You young people don't know this song, Gino? If you don't say you know it, I will sing it. Okay? So basically what happened was, in that process of population change, the Catholic primary school was left on the Protestant side. So one of the problems that then arose was when the Loyalists came together and they organised a campaign to stop Catholics entering their community. And this led to this very famous scene. This is, I think, 2000, around 2001, where a Loyalist threw a bomb, a hand grenade type bomb, at the school children when they were going to school. And you can see this was an image went all around the world of the fear on the child's face. Okay. You can see here, in the Republican representation of this, the state stands by. The police didn't arrest anybody, they didn't chase anybody. The representation being that the state is not neutral. Then you have the representation of the vulnerability of children and women who were taking the children to school. And then you have this representation of Arkansas, Little Rock, Arkansas, with the integration by race in 1957. Now, that comes about because of that hot nationalism, those tensions over territory, those issues that arose at that time. There's a slight problem with this mural. It's quite right to display this disgusting event and what happened. Arkansas was about integration. These people are sending their children to a Catholic school. This is about segregated education. This is about integrated education. But it's using the common sense of oppression and victimhood. And of course, if they do it, then the Protestants have to do it. So these wall murals also appeared at the same time, which was about events in the 1600s when there was a Catholic Irish uprising, which led to the death of thousands of Protestants at that time. Now remember this image because we'll show you how it's changed in a minute. So this is the same issue of victimhood, persecution, etc. Here's another example that appeared at the time of the Holy Cross dispute within the Loyalist community. And these are all bombings of Protestant bars and shops in the Shankill Road by the IRA. So the question about, the IRA are not non-sectarian. The IRA targeted non-military targets, non-economic targets, legitimate targets. And here's a very famous event in 1971 when three or four people died, and one of them was a baby. And you can see here the different interpretation. The state is helping. That relationship to the state is positive compared to the previous image that the state is negative. So it's the same sort of tit-for-tat representation of victimhood at that time. Now, one of the things you'll know about is the flag protest, and you'll know about this issue of the flag over City Hall. And for Unionists, that was really important because it's part of their symbolism that had flown there for 100 years. Northern Ireland is in the United Kingdom, it's part of Britain, why can't you fly your flag? And what was interesting about that process that created the flag protest, that created that type of hot nationalism, was the fact that the nationalist Sinn Féin and Republican were given support by the Alliance Party to meet halfway, which was the flag, as it was probably here, the flag designated things. So within unionism, that created a great deal of frustration and anger and some sort of street protest and violence. Now, what's that really about? It's about an electorate that has turned away from voting. The Alliance Party, although it's numerically small, its vote is actually going up in the last two elections. The Ulster Unionist Party have virtually disappeared. The SDLP are on the way to disappearing. Sinn Féin have lost nearly 20% of their vote. Because people are standing against them now who are dissidents, or people are saying, what have you actually delivered for us? What have you actually done? So one of the things that's interesting about this is that climate is based upon an increasingly sectarian electorate. The people who are voting are the people who care about flags. There's a significant section of society which is just walked away. Those are dramatic declines in voting within this society. So one of the allegations that is made of Sinn Féin is you got the flag down because you can then turn around to your people and say, hey, we got one up in the Prods. So you take away the dissent. And people are saying, what do you actually do for us? What do you actually do? There's a nasty politics, both within unionism and republicanism, which wasn't helped that before this happened, the Alliance Party also won East Belfast. They took the seat of the First Minister, Peter Robinson, who's, we won't go into the details of that, but there were shenanigans with property developers and sex and all sorts of things. But the Alliance Party is starting to grow. This liberal unionist, liberal party is starting to grow again. And they had captured East Belfast, and they were the ones who held power in the Assembly about, the City Hall about would the flag stay or would the flag go. So the Ulster Unionist Party and the DUP, both of whom were losing votes, put out 40,000 leaflets in a city of 250,000 people in Protestant areas, basically saying these liberals are the people to blame. Now, the Alliance Party did what they believe. They're post-nationalists. They believe you shouldn't cause offence to any sectional society. They believe in the idea of, flying the flag on designated days respects one tradition, and not flying it respects the other tradition. That is seen as an assault, because these political parties are in crisis. They are losing votes. They are losing the electorate. Society is changing. Linked to that was also sectarianism within republicanism. This was posted all over Facebook, etc., with other cartoons and jokes, etc. Sleigh bell rings, are you listening? The Union flag has gone missing. The Huns, that's a negative word for Protestants. Smashed up the town is the crown rag, which is important to them, calling the Union flag a crown rag. It's very controversial. Came down, walking in a Fenian Wonderland. Fenian is a negative word for Catholics. Actually using that word about yourself, it's very peculiar. It's self-sectarianism that has taken place. So the event created this is all the hot national, this is all the past, this is all the unpreparedness to move forward, putting everything in a sectarian context. In Northern Ireland, you'd have heard of the Orange Order, yep. The people who marched with the collarettes, and they marched from March until October. We call this the Orange Order calendar. January, February, March, October, November, December. Okay? And this is one of the problems in our society, because whenever the IRA was disbanded, they were turned into community groups. And because you can't just, one of the problems for Sinn Féin was you can't turn off a military conflict just like that. Because the history tells you in other societies, when you stop a conflict abruptly, it restarts pretty quickly soon after. Because the people who work at Balkans go home, sit 6 months later and go, nothing's changed. They go back to war and go back to conflict. So these residence groups were set up to stop these Protestant organisations marching in Catholic areas. This is a classic catch-22 that sectarianism can't resolve. Whose rights do you respect? Do you respect the right of assembly? This is a universal right. Or do you respect the right of offence? How do you solve that? If you only think sectarian terms, you only one answer to that. If you're the Orange Order supporter, well, of course we should march where we want, this is the Queen's Highway. If you're a Republican, they can't march through our community because it's offensive. Sectarianised the game, although some of that has been solved in recent times. Here's Queen's University Belfast. Here's an example of one of the other catch-22s. This is Protestant art doing. Remember the mural of the children, or the child going to school? So on the other side of that wall are the Catholic population has a 6-year waiting list for social housing. On the Protestant side, before the riots started and the conflict over Holy Cross started, you had about 200 empty homes. So what's happening in Belfast is the Protestant population is declining and it's moving out of the city. Okay? So you have this vacant land. Catch-22, the Republicans say it's very simple, take this wall, this peace wall, and move it and build us new houses. And some of the loyalists said, if you do that, we will shoot people. Because this is our territory, and people died for this territory, and there's no way we're giving this to them. It's symbolically too important to us. So yet again, social need is not constructed in a pluralist way. Social need is constructed in a, we want this, you're not having it. And that might sound very petty, but that's very much what it is, in many ways. This is a classic example of hot nationalism and resource competition. This is Madrid Street in East Belfast. And during the conflict, so the Protestants live on this side, the Catholics live on that side. During the conflict, this gate was this was always open. This road was always open during the conflict. Okay? There was a small gate that was locked at night time stop drive-by shootings and stuff like that. This led to community violence and around the time of Holy Cross, disputes. This was resolved in the following way. On the far side, there's a 5-year waiting list again for the Catholic community, and this side there was dereliction. This was resolved by the DUP and the Sinn Féin in the following way. The Protestant side demanded a wall went up, so as you could secure the space in which they lived, and new houses were built. And Sinn Féin agreed to that because on the far side of Short Strand, a brownfield site became available, and they could build homes there for Catholics. So you have a road that's open throughout the conflict. We have communities which are divided. You need a symbolism of movement through the city. You need to open the city up. And you get this hot nationalism, resource competition, where you get this and we get that. Now, let's move on to something more positive. One of the things that has happened is some of those people who were paramilitary, some of those people who were involved in paramilitary activity, have taken on a conflict transformation role. And they've started to change the images of the murals. They're trying to find, they're not saying they're no longer Republican, and they're no longer loyalist, but what they're saying is, you have to find some way that we take the heat out of this conflict. We have to create new images, new ideas. Probably the young people don't know who this is either, the world's greatest footballer, George Best. Okay. So this was a UVF wall mural, which and the IRA in East Belfast and UVF in East Belfast sat down, and the IRA said, this is really offensive to our community because we can see this UVF mural. What do we do? And the idea was, we all have one shared person that we can respect, which is respect for George is a peculiar word, but anyway, that we can respect, and that is George Best. So a shared image went up, and this is the cooling of the national. This is the process which has taken place. One of these other murals nearby was a very significant UVF mural. This was then converted into a local history project. So here we have the celebration of the Titanic. And as we said in Belfast, it was okay whenever it left Belfast, until it was taken over by an English captain. Okay. But what's interesting here is sort of taking away a paramilitary image and creating a more, not necessarily a shared history, but using history, using some way of creating social bonds within community. Also challenging, taking down other murals, challenging the rise in crime. There's been a rise in drugs and crime in Northern Ireland since the ceasefires began. And in this sense, looking at the whole issues of how do you be positive, how do you create restorative justice, how do you change the way in which people understand their community and what is happening within it. So this process of cooling. This has been undertaken by those Republicans and Loyalists who want to create some sort of shared future, some sort of change in the spirit of the agreement. And of course, this also means bringing Catholic and Protestant kids together. So that this is in the Shankill Road, and this was a Loyalist paramilitary mural here, and they brought kids who were the children of IRA prisoners, and they brought kids who were the children of Loyalist prisoners, and they brought them together to work on this shared project. So trying to change the narrative and the relationship between place. So as you know, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, Narnia, was written by C.S. Lewis, who came from, I assume Belfast, it's on a wall mural in Belfast, okay? So what we did, we sat down with the kids and we said, right, let's think about this. What do you want to see? And they said, we want to see something that's for young people. I believe this is called tagging. Is that age that's really scary when you get to, whenever you see the charts and you don't know any of the bands anymore, or the music, So this is called tagging, I believe. So they said they wanted to be lively, they wanted to be something about youth culture. So we allowed them to tag. I think, I don't even know what that says. We said Narnia or something, but I can't read it, but too old. And what you have is a path that goes through Belfast. So they wanted to celebrate the city. So all along that wall mural are different images that celebrate the city. So when you stand there, you can see the shipyard, you can see those big cranes that dominate Belfast, they're still there. You know they don't build ships anymore. And then you have the depiction in a cartoon fashion. So that's about cooling and changing relationships and trying to get people to move forward. Challenging racism is also very important in lots of these new wall murals. So what you're saying is, you've come out of this conflict, but there are other conflicts. There's crime, there's racism, there's other ways we have to bond people and work together for a more shared, common understanding of place and of our identity. It's more complex than Republican and loyalism. There's other things we need to think about which are affecting both communities, both situations. And this is one, do you remember the one of the people being stabbed on the ground with the horses, the loyalist mural about the 1600 conflict? This is what it is today. Okay? So when we work with the loyalists on this, we said, okay, you are loyalist paramilitaries. You're 99.9% male. You're adults, and you have put up these wall murals for 20 or 30 years without negotiating with anybody. So what we want you to do is we want you to go and talk to people in the community and discuss a new image. So let's not talk about persecution and victimhood, because if you do that, the Republic doesn't do that. So what can we do? What can we actually talk about? And people said, well, round here there's poverty. Round here there's youth suicide. Round here there's poor educational outcomes. So in trying to change the image, what we thought to do was to represent the needs of a community. What are the needs? How do we create a new political platform? How do we start to understand poverty in a different way? Or the problems of living in a working class community? So there was a part of this land was going to be taken over by a property developer. Thank God for the recession. Okay, in that sense, to stop all of this gentrification of the city. So there's a social justice issue. Let's stop gentrification of our community. Okay. Everybody should be listened to and respected, and this represents an immigrant family, that they, from a different racial background, that they're part of our community. They deserve to be listened to. They deserve to be participated with. Our schools, they don't deliver. How do we get better social justice in education? How do we get an education process that transforms young people's lives? Let's recognise there's mental health issues. Let's discuss them. Let's get people to seek help. Let's set up our own ways of dealing and coping and helping people with mental health problems. Let's think about how we create employment. We know we're not going to get into the labour market in the way that we want. Let's think about creating our own social economy. Within this area now, there are 150 people working in social economy that has come out of this re-imaging and rethinking about the conflict. So let's create our own economy. Let's sustain it within its own ways. And let's have ways that people can participate, etc. Now, the clever bit about the mural, I think, is the attic. Because in the attic are the tools for renewal. What would have been in the attic in 1974, 85, 92? Kalashnikov, bullets, Semtex. They don't transform, they don't build, they don't change society. So what's really clever here is that you now have changed what the attic means. That space is where you put the tools for renewal, for regeneration, for moving forward. Now, not everybody is subverted to this, not everybody agrees with these types of images, but it's people taking on a leadership role, who understand what conflict does to people, etc. Now, we've got to the happy bit at the end. You'll always notice if you come to Northern Ireland that people, especially Belfast, people sitting around shouting at each other, but it doesn't really mean anything. So my English friends come over, they go, you all sit and shout at each other and row with each other, but you're always be friends, and that's just our culture. We just like to stand up for ourselves. So, let's think about the new Northern Ireland. This thing that's appearing which is different. And I think this is really important because this is not controlled by the political elite. This is organic. It's about wider lifestyle and consumption changes in Europe, globally. It's about new relationships. It's about new hope. It's about new aspirations. So since devolution in 1998, 49% of the population in 1998 who were Catholics wanted a united Ireland. That has now fallen to 33%. I said this to a friend of mine who was Republican. I said, if I'd have said that when I was young, my father would have kicked me up the backside. You had to subscribe to get into the Republican area too. We must have unity, we must have unity. Why has that happened? Why have more and more members of the Catholic community decided that they're better off in London? So I asked my wife, who's from a different faith, different background from myself, and I said, do you want United Ireland? Now I remember her when I first met her. And she really wanted United Ireland. Okay? And I said, do you want United Ireland today? She said, no. And I said, why? She said, because I feel included in the state. I feel I'm an equal citizen. I feel like I feel that I'm part of this society now. I feel that I'm listened to. I feel that my values are now held up as much as anybody else's. So her experiences has been some sort of democratisation of her position as an Irish Catholic nationalist Republican. She feels that she's now part of society in that way. I said, what about your national identity? She says, I have it. I have an Irish passport. I said, why don't you want United Ireland? She said, because I don't feel Irish and I don't feel British, I feel somewhere in between the two. So that's back to Granny's badge. It's back to a distinct sort of northern sense of who you are. You don't feel fully Irish, you don't feel British, but you feel something in between. Between 1999 and 2010, the share who consider themselves to be Northern Irish rose from 19 to 28%. Many of these people are Catholics, which must, I think, fit into that sense of being part of society now, feeling involved in that society. A 13% decline in the same period in Britishness, and a 10% decline in people considering themselves to be Irish. We've had 3,600 people killed, we've had millions of pounds wasted rebuilding the damage that was in our society, we've had collusion, we've had state abuse, we've had state repression, we've created this new political system, and it seems that people are walking away from it towards a middle class, liberal, more hybrid sense of identity. When you follow this data through, these people don't vote. These are the people who have walked away. They don't want to be part of that sectarianism that is repetitive and stale and going nowhere. 2/3 of those aged 18 to 24 now consider themselves to be neither unionist nor nationalist. When I was young, you had to have a label. If you didn't have one, you were given one. You had to be British or Irish, and that's what you had to be, unless you were that bit that sat in the middle. That's really peculiar to me and for my generation, is that so many young people don't adopt these labels. In the same way, 2/3. So there's something happening there, which is they're not attracted by hot nationalism. They're not attracted by contention. They're not attracted by old ideas of identity. They're not particularly interested in this. So all of this has been paralleled, as I said, by this big decline from 70% to 54% in those who vote. The records actually got bigger in America, but the numbers voting is declining, declining, declining. A bit like Britain. Same process. Fewer people voting, fewer people taking part. People don't trust these people don't trust the political elite. They don't see any advantage in the political elite. They don't see any need to be involved in resource competition. One of the things that's really interesting about the culture of Belfast is the growth in the gay and lesbian community. Which in Belfast we have an area which is distinctly a gay bar, nightclub area. We have a gay pride event, which is one of the biggest gay pride events in Europe. That type of cultural change took place because you can't sectarianise it. Gays aren't Protestants and lesbians aren't Catholics. Their sexuality is an identity. It's an identity that has grown, become more forceful and much more present in the city. It's people seeking their identity through their sexuality. You can't stop it because you can't sectarianise it. So this is some part of this process that's also taking place, especially amongst the young. They're not living in the same fear, they're not living in the same tensions. They're finding ways to communicate and live and work together. When I got married to my wife, there were 6% of all marriages in Northern Ireland were mixed marriages. 6% were mixed marriages. That's now 12%. 20 years later, it's now 12%. It's doubled. And we reckon, given that people don't necessarily marry now, but they will have long-term relationships, we're starting to reckon it's about a fifth to a quarter are now mixed relationships. Now, when you have your kids, what are they? They're hybrid. They're back to great grandma's marriage. The mixture of cultures. So I think one of the things we need to start thinking about Northern Ireland is that there's various shades of green. There's the staunch republicanism, but there's also a conciliatory transformative republicanism. There's a staunch loyalist unionism, but there's also a conciliatory unionism and loyalism. What also is happening is there's something which is no identity at all, which is an identity which is chosen as different. So we're moving away from orthodoxies, and I think this is placing us in a very dangerous position. Because what we're ending up with, if you take out some of the people who vote for the Alliance Party and take out some of the people who vote for left parties or green parties, etc., you're really close to the core of the hot nationalists being the only people who really have power in society. And that means the only people who are going to vote for you are the people who care about victims, who care about symbols, who care about identity. You're not going to liberalise your politics. You're not going to create a post-conflict type politics. You're going to maintain, as we saw with the flag protest, as we see with victims, you're going to maintain the old stereotypical politics because you are not threatened. You'll get elected because those people will elect you. There has to be something in Northern Ireland where this identity change is politicised. It has to take on a political form. It may happen in this generation, it may happen in a future generation, but it has to happen. You cannot have a country in which 20% of the voters elect the government. Sorry, 38%. 38% of the voters elect the two main parties. So there's you can adopt this lifestyle, you can adopt these attitudes, but you need to take on some responsibility for the society in which you live. Because if you don't, the same repetitive nonsense will continue on and on and on. Thank you.